Here we go, Chapter 7. It was the busiest day of the season so far. The road from London Bridge to Greenwich was so crowded with coaches that whip fights broke out among the drivers. Their passengers poured through the park gates, dancing and singing in a heaving, steaming mass. The drinking tents ran out of beer, the circus sold out for its show, and queues trailed from every caravan and stall that lined the path. Wild Boy usually hated busy days when there was less time to spy on the fair, but today he was glad of the crowds. With so many punters, there was no chance for Augustus Finch to seek revenge for last night. But Finch hadn't forgotten. With each painful step on his wounded foot, he cast a vicious glare at Wild Boy. It was his signal that, soon enough, harm would be done. But that afternoon, Wild Boy's mind was on something else. The letter. Over and over he told himself to get rid of it, but he kept sneaking looks. He must have read it a dozen times that day, and it still sent a chill down his back. Murder. It was a dark business, even for a fairground. And Clarissa was right. The warning had never been received. She was right about something else too. Wild Boy could tell who the letter was meant for. In fact, he thought he already knew. He kept thinking about what Clarissa had said, how it would be his fault if the person was killed. Deep down, he knew she was right. If he could do something to stop it, then he had to try. But that wasn't the only reason that he decided to deliver the letter. It was a mystery, and he was curious to find out more. That evening, the wind had settled and a cool mist drifted across the fairground. Wild Boy's pulse raced as he sneaked behind the caravans and around the side of the circus tent, dodging signs warning circus crew only and no freaks past here. It was dangerous just being here. Wherever the fair travelled, freaks and their showmen always camped apart from the circus crew. It had been that way ever since the circus star acrobat ran off with a heavily tattooed performer called the Painted Lady. That acrobat was Clarissa's father. That was before Wild Boy's time there, but he knew the story. Clarissa's father had been one of the best acrobats in England, and so had her mother. The three of them used to perform together, thrilling crowds in their red and gold costumes. Wild Boy had heard that those were happy times for the circus. But when Clarissa's father ran off, he left Mary Everett a bitter, broken woman. One night she walked drunk on the tightrope, fell and broke her leg. She never performed again. Instead, she became the ringmaster, and she had developed a hatred of freaks that bordered on obsession. Wild Boy dreaded to think how she'd react if she caught him sneaking around her show. But if he wanted to deliver this letter, that was where he had to go. He peeked around the side of one of the circus's dressing vans. Close by, the big top strained in the wind against its thick tethers. From inside, he heard Mary Everett cry, "Ladies and gentlemen!" The last show of the day was underway. He breathed in, steeling himself. Then he dashed for the side of the big top. He heard someone cry out, and he threw himself to the ground, sliding through the mud and under the canvas wall. The crowd roared, and for a dreadful moment, Wild Boy feared he'd burst right into the ring. He rolled over, wiping muddy hair from his eyes. Then he saw a jumble of wooden beams above his head and knew he'd ended up in the right place, beneath the scaffold that supported the audience's seats. "So far, so good," he muttered. He reached up and began to climb the beams. Between the audience's backs, he could just see down into the sawdust ring, where Mary Everett stood in the spluttering glare of a gas chandelier. The ringmaster leaned on a wooden crutch, bellowing at the crowd like a mad pirate. "Here's another act. Pay attention, will you?" Before her husband ran off, Mary Everett had apparently been a beautiful woman. Wild Boy couldn't imagine it now. She had the same fiery red hair as Clarissa, except it was greasy and straggly, hanging like wet straw beneath the brim of her battered top hat. Whether she also had Clarissa's pale skin or freckles was impossible to say, for her face was covered with the thick layer of white makeup that fairground rumours said she hadn't rubbed off since the day her husband disappeared. Wild Boy perched on a beam, waiting for one particular act. He'd never actually seen the circus show before, and couldn't believe how bad it was. Each time Mary Everett banged her crutch against a gong, another act stumbled into the ring. Drunken clowns broke into fights, trick riders messed up their tricks, and knife throwers missed their marks with rusty blades. The audience booed. Someone even burst into tears. The crowd settled down as, high above, Clarissa strode along a tightrope. Sequins glimmered on her costume as she jumped into a somersault and landed again on the wire with barely a wobble. For a moment, Wild Boy forgot all about the letter as he watched in amazement. Clarissa wasn't just good, she was astounding. All of the anger had vanished from her face and her eyes sparkled with delight. Wild Boy wondered if this was her escape. Did she feel the same way doing this as he did spying on crowds? She ain't half bad, he muttered. He focused his thoughts back on the letter. Most of the acts were over, which meant the person he was waiting for was due on next. He brought the letter from his coat pocket and read it again. I know who you are, but so does another who is after the machine. For God's sake, run! Run before you are murdered! So who was it written for? Obviously someone who lived at the fair in disguise, but that hardly narrowed the list. There were several people here whom Wild Boy suspected lived under false identities. A more helpful question was, who wrote it? He'd never received a letter in his life, but he assumed they were sent between people with shared interests. And on that subject, the letter presented several clues. 1. The writer was wealthy. That was obvious from the paper, thick and grainy and clearly of fine quality. 2. The writer was a heavy drinker. A red spot on the page smelled like wine, while variations in the shade of the ink showed he'd refreshed his quill 3 times. Unnecessary for such a short note, unless he'd paused to drink his wine. 3. The letter had been written near an open window. The ink had dried in one direction, suggesting a slight but constant breeze. 4. The writer may have conducted scientific experiments. This much Wild Boy guessed from a tiny burn mark in the corner, which was too small and precise to have been made by a flame. It could have been a coal spark, but why light a fire near an open window? He wouldn't have considered experiments as the cause had it not been for an intriguing coincidence. A flash of light dazzled Wild Boy. Down in the ring, a new act had begun. A man with a shabby leather bag stood beside a table that was cluttered with scientific objects. Pairs of zinc and copper plates, half submerged in glasses of golden fluid, silver wires strung between copper coils, glass cylinders mounted on wooden frames. He was a crooked old man with a monk's ring of grey hair and round shaded spectacles perched on a wine-red nose. Professor Henry Wollstonecraft. This was the man, Wild Boy was certain, for whom the letter was meant. It had been written to someone in disguise, and he suspected that was true of the professor. He could tell the man had been wealthy once. His suits, now worn and crumpled, had been tailored for him, and he wore an expensive-looking ring, gold with a raised letter G on its surface. Wild Boy wondered if that was an initial of the old scientist's real name. He watched as the professor performed tricks with a mysterious new phenomenon called electricity. Sparks crackled along the wires and shot into the air like white-hot fireworks, reflecting off his dark spectacle lenses. The tricks were incredible, but the professor's act entirely lacked showmanship. When the old man finally looked up, he seemed almost surprised to see an audience and utterly confused as to what he might say to them. But then they'd had enough anyway, and another chorus of boos filled the big top. Still without a word, the professor packed up his bag and shuffled away through a fading haze of smoke. Wild Boy set off again through the scaffold. If he could climb close, he could drop the letter in the professor's path as he left the ring. But just as he got near, his coat snagged on one of the beams. He turned to tear it free, but he was already too late. Professor Wollstonecraft passed through a gap in the tent wall and out into the night. Wildboy cursed. What now? Could he sneak to the professor's caravan and leave the letter there? Oh, it was risky. If he was caught, the circus crew would think he was stealing. But this was not the sort of letter that could go undelivered. He ripped his coat from the beam, leaped from the scaffold, and rushed through the exit. It didn't take long to find the professor's van. Because of the fire risk from his experiments, Wollstonecraft's was the only caravan at the fair that was made entirely of metal. A rusty, corrugated iron box parked among the sprawl of pop carts and dressing wagons behind the big top. Tingling with fear and excitement, Wildboy crept closer. He heard someone trudging along the path from the big top and quickly hid again behind one of the carts. Peeking around the side, he was surprised to see that it was Mary Everett. Why had the ringmaster left her own show? She looked even angrier than usual. Leaning heavily on her crutch, she swore and banged a fist against one of the vans. Every instinct told Wildboy to run, but again he felt the page in his coat pocket. Someone was out to murder the professor. He couldn't just let it happen. All he needed to do was to get into that van and drop this letter. Just a few seconds, that was all. How much trouble could that cause? As soon as the ringmaster was gone, he darted across the path, up the caravan steps, and he was inside.